A lot of people are talking about racism these days. It's so weird because I thought we had solved it. We've abolished slavery, haven't we? Or at least haven't most countries? Why then are so many people in the media obsessed with racism? They should just get over it. Or maybe they shouldn't, and maybe there's very good reason for talking about it. I'm going to devote 2 talks to this. In the first talk, this one I'm entitling Racism, Colonialism, and Orientalism. I want to talk about the Haitian revolt, or revolution, encouraged in large part by a general, Toussaint Louverture, or Toussaint Louverture. And then I also want to talk about Edward Said and his concept of Orientalism and how the process of racism happens, or how the binary logic plays into a hatred of the other, or turning the other person into an object or a non-human being. In my second talk, I want to talk about, which I'm going to call Racism, Decolonization, and the Role of Anger and Resentment. There, I want to look at Frantz Fanon and what might decolonization look like after we figured out what colonization is. And then Glenn Coulthard, I want to talk about colonialism specifically in Canada, but this applies to other colonial relationships with indigenous populations and peoples, and what role anger or resentment might play in these things. So if any of this interests you, I hope you find something of value in it. That's where I'm going. Again, as a white man talking about issues of racism, I simply have to do my best, knowing that it's very hard to imagine what it's like to walk a mile in the shoes of another person, but I'll do my best. If we're honest with one another, we probably feel this general sense that when the system is wrong, or when society has structures or institutions, powers that seem overwhelmingly in control, and we know they're corrupt, and we know they're bad, there's just this overwhelming feeling of, well, what are we going to do about it? What can I, as an individual or even a small collective, what can we possibly do about it? The story of Haiti, when you hear Haiti today, if you don't know where Haiti is, you can find a map of the Americas. You can find Florida. I'm sure you can find Florida. Look below, find Cuba. Look below, you'll find today what's called Haiti. And often people assume, well, it's just a very poor country and that's its history. In fact, the history of Haiti is much richer than that, and it offers us some insights into one of the world's most successful slave revolts and what that might mean. The story of Haiti, or then Saint-Domingue was the name, Saint-Domingue, I think I pronounced that correctly, gives us a sense of possibility. When the systems do look overwhelming, when the soldiers are well trained and they have weapons and they're telling us what to do we just give up? Or are there ways of fixing the system from within that might be to our advantage? So, our tyrannical overlords getting you down, what can we do about it? Let's talk briefly, what is colonialism? Colonialism, in the simplest terms, is a group of people with power, political, military. They go from one place, they go to another. And they take the stuff, they take the land, they may even take the people that are in this other place. They have no birthright to it, they haven't earned it, they just take it. Because they can, they're more powerful, or they're more crafty perhaps, or they're more cunning. Other people might call crafty and cunning just, they're more evil, right? They'll do what they think they think they can get away with to con people out of things. So a lot of ways colonialism can happen. And it's important to know that it's not just about taking land and taking stuff. There can also be a colonialism of the mind, a psychology of colonizing our minds, getting people to accept their second class or third class or just no class citizenship. I'm not a real human being, right? Getting people to think that they're not worthy of having any kind of power or any kind of vote or any kind of say. There's sociological forms of colonization, all of these things mixed together, cultural appropriations and whatnot. Colonizing is typically associated for that which is unfair, unequal, and generally results in death, bloodshed. more modern forms of colonization can be through legal reform that favors certain people and disfavors other people. So there may be less bloodshed in the more modern forms of colonization, but you better believe it's just, I shouldn't say just as alive, but it's certainly a very real thing in the world today. So what is colonization? People treating other people as less than, people abusing and using other people. It has a history, of course, that's you can read. Each country has its own form of colonization, whether you're talking about Portugal, Spain, Britain, Netherlands, Russia, France. All of these countries have very clear histories of going to other places and setting up colonies in Asia, Africa, the Americas, and so on. The irony here is that those who have traditionally been the colonizers are also the ones who have spoken up most fervently about equality and liberty, a universal rationality. And yet the hypocrisy, so the irony of the hypocrisy here, is that they've also been the greatest force for slavery, for violent overtaking of other people, obviously against their will. So they get equality and liberty, and they get to call themselves rational. But as we'll see in the case of Haiti right now, everybody else gets to be a slave. Everybody else gets to be used. It's a very strange messaging. Is that true today? Are you living in a culture that's saying equality before the law, equality of opportunity, you and I, brothers and sisters, we're compatriots, somehow we're equal. And yet it's obvious to you that you're not equal. Right? It's obvious that they're doing whatever they can to leverage the idea or the concept of equality against you. So yes, I think that sounds familiar, and I can see it playing itself out today, which is why so many people are still talking about racism. So we're talking principally now about the late 1700s, and Haiti is a French colony. I think it's originally, it was the Spanish that had it, and then the French have it. And its population is interesting. Roughly 90% of the population in the late 1700s, roughly 90% of the population are slaves, 5% are white people, and 5% are free colored people. There are different reasons for this, but the obvious one is that a lot of the slave owners would have children with slaves, and those would be not completely black, they wouldn't be completely white. And so these slave owners would free their own children, and then you would have sort of this another layer of society with certain people at the top and then a mid-range, and of course, and the slaves at the bottom. By the late 1700s, this slave population of Haiti was responsible, and it was about 500,000 slaves, about 500,000. They were responsible for producing half the sugar and coffee for Europe, about 40% of the sugar, 60% of the coffee for Europe and America. In other words, it was big business. This was a rich place in resources, a very poor population because 90% of them were slaves. But the people who controlled the manufacture of this wealth were incredibly wealthy and powerful because of it. And so we see the primary motive for slavery isn't just that it's entertaining or interesting, it's that it's lucrative. Capitalism at the expense of others, capitalism at the expense of people's humanity. The death rate was quite high in Haiti. I've heard different things, but there was a science of slavery to the point where they had an average of 3 years that they could expect of productive labor from a new slave being sent over. They would have a lot of African slaves sent over. I've heard numbers close to 1 million, and they would have to do this because people would just keep dying. And of course, they were treating their slaves very poorly, and so there you go. It might be malaria, yellow fever, you name it, but clearly the work conditions weren't very favorable. So each slave had, give or take, a 3-year lifespan, which is incredible, right? When I buy milk at the grocery store, I know I've got a due date. I buy yogurt, I've got a due date. These are objects to be consumed. In Haiti, it was people being consumed. It's hard to imagine in a different form, clearly a different form, we see that today, right? The exploitive labor class of minimum wage jobs where people cannot possibly survive in any sustained, healthy manner. And yet where I am, a very large percentage, I think close to half of all of the jobs in the province where I live are these minimum wage type jobs. I don't know how people are living. I don't know how they're affording healthy food, car payment, mortgage payment. Is it any wonder our debt load is so high? Now, I'm not equating what was going on in Haiti, where a slave owner could sell your children to someone working in a local restaurant here. They're not the same thing, but there are certainly parallels there to the exploitive way of thinking about human beings as to be used up as if they were a product. And there have been a number of interesting stories with COVID and how employees have been treated in terms of their safety, and how employers who want to keep the profit going treat them, but that's for another time. What am I saying? I'm saying that in the name of sugar and coffee, in the name of money, thousands and thousands and hundreds of thousands of people were being enslaved. When I get my coffee today, I don't have sugar, I have a sweetener or something like that, but I can't imagine having a product that I know is the direct result of slave labor. And there you have it. So Haiti, as sort of a snapshot, a tiered system where human beings, depending on their socioeconomic status and their color of skin, had different powers. If you were a slave, you had no citizenship. There was a fight because of the French Revolution sparked much of this. And the idea was that people were equal, that they all deserved some form of liberty. So the freed colored people wanted citizenship. And at one point they received it. But then the slaves, they were refused citizenship. And so they got upset and rebelled, and we have the story of Haiti, a much larger revolution than had ever been seen before. By 1804, unfortunately, after the passing of General Louverture, it became the first black republic, an independent country, because of the efforts of people to say no to the exploitive system, because of the efforts of people who took seriously the Enlightenment or French Revolution motive of equality and liberty for all. So the principal leader in all of this, Francois Dominique Toussaint Louverture, I can almost pronounce that correctly, Haitian general, initially was not interested in a full-on revolution, and that makes sense. If the revolution failed, if you were the leader, and let's revolt, and by revolt, it's not small scale, we're in a full-on rebellion, we're saying no to the power structures that be. And it was obvious that if you failed at that, people would die. So I wouldn't want that responsibility, right, of encouraging people to stand up. And yet, of course, there came a point where that had to happen. He wanted to work with the powers, and he did. He was originally a general for the Spanish army because it suited his purposes. He was working within the system to effect some kind of change. And when he saw that the French were willing to grant or do certain things, he sided himself with the French. So he was with the French and the Spanish, and then back with the French again. And not to say that he was being hypocritical in any way, or that he was disloyal in any way. In fact, he was clearly loyal to the cause of freedom, liberty, and equality. And so he did what he could to make that happen. When the overt revolt began, like the people standing up, bloodshed, 1791 in the Northern Plantation, it was enormous, some 50,000 people. That's incredible, 50,000 people. And this would go up to 500,000 people. But when it was all said and done, of course, thousands of people were dead. Not just because of the fighting, which was gruesome and barbaric and terrible as fighting can be, also because of malaria, yellow fever, and not just the slaves, of course, who won, and with them non-slaves, but the military, those who had been sent by Napoleon, thousands would die. Toussaint believed that Haitians wanted to be French citizens. And by being a French citizen, that didn't just mean that you would be able to vote in a rigged election or something like that, but that you had personhood, that you were acknowledged by nature to be a human being of equal standing with other human beings. So it wasn't just a theoretical thing. It went right to the very core of who am I as a person. He also believed that Haitians were not willing to go back to slavery and that they would rather see Haiti burn. And many of them did burn the plantations, the symbols of oppression, in the name of freedom. And he would have to not only encourage people to rise up and stand for their dignity as human beings, but he would also have to encourage them to return to work, which will be interesting. We'll talk about that in just a moment. Even though they were fighting against trained soldiers, armies, they won. Even though they were fighting against a system of years and years of indoctrination that said that you were not fully human, that you were not the same as other people, they were able to say no and to change that. And that's incredible. Just to imagine that. I can't really fully imagine it, obviously, but that by itself is an inspiration that rethinking culture isn't just a benign, abstract, something you do for fun on the weekend activity. Reimagining culture and acting on that can have a difference. So what do? Have some sense of freedom. After years of being brutalized, children sold into slavery, spouses killed, beaten, people beheaded, and just the worst things you've ever seen. The worst you've ever seen in the movies. This is what's happening in Haiti. Well, now you have a sense of power. If it was me, I'm imagining it, I would want revenge, and that's probably all that I would want, just going around killing all the white people. And then I would want to take their stuff and their wealth, and I would want to run away, buy a tropical island somewhere else. I would want to get away. So burn everything down, get my revenge, steal their stuff, I'm out. That's not his philosophy. Louverture argues that first, liberty has to be universal. You can't just perpetuate the cycle by moving from being a victim to a victimizer. That's not the goal here. And for him, the goal was to return to work, but now you would return to work and you would reap the rewards of your labor. So you're not just being exploited for somebody else, you would have a sense of purpose. You would have a sense of, I've put my effort into something and the virtue of my hard work has given me a result. I can imagine, of course, wanting to wallow in hatred, but perhaps one of the most difficult parts of the slave revolt is not letting hatred stop you or hold you back or frustrate you becoming something else and doing something else with your life. So there's this motivation now by Toussaint to say we need to restore the plantations, we need to get people back to work, and he's going to do it somewhat forcibly. He's not going to reinstall a slavery system, but he is going to say that if you really want an investment, that you need to stay on the plantation and really be involved with this. So it's kind of compromise. It's not free liberal capitalism today. But the way forward is one of cohabitation. The way forward is one in which, maybe I should, to go back to Nietzsche, in which resentment doesn't hold you back. Your new power of liberty, equality, and fraternity, these are the catchphrases of the French Revolution, should empower you for something more. I love this quote. It's a little long, but let me read it. "We are your equals then, by natural right, and if nature pleases itself to diversify colors within the human race, it is not a crime to be born black, nor advantage to be white. For too long we have borne your chains without thinking of shaking them off. But any authority which is not founded on virtue and humanity, and which tends to subject one's fellow man to slavery, must come to an end, and that end is yours. This is really interesting, Louverture's quote here. We are your equals by natural right. If nature pleases itself to diversify colors, it's not a crime to be born black, nor a crime to be born white. Any authority which is not founded on virtue and humanity, and that subjects other people, needs to come to an end. Any authority not bearing witness to your humanity, your dignity, your worth, needs to be done away with. Do we see those forces in play today? Absolutely. And again, that's why people are talking about racism. 2020 going forward, people are still, because it's there. Humans treating other people as if they're not. Louverture tells us that liberty for all means more than just a sense of revenge, a sense of taking out suffering and pain that you've been dealt and giving it to somebody else. Look forward. Envision what liberty might mean for you and live that. Envision what liberty might mean and live that. At one point, apparently, he was offered a kingship or very high standing, and I think by two world powers, both the British and the French, I think, offered it to him. I can't be sure, I can't remember. The US and Britain, I can't recall. But just imagine being told, hey, listen, you want to be king of your own little country somewhere? I would have a very hard time saying no. But again, his philosophy is, if it's liberty, it's for all. And power is just a means. Power is just a means to something. If power is an end in itself, there's a problem, which is what they were offering him. But power as a means to an end, that end would be liberty for all. Fascinating, fascinating, really. Clearly, we're talking about matters of virtue or character now. Knowing what really matters. Maybe that's the best way to phrase it, knowing what really matters. So here's a man who was born a slave, he was freed, was able to become educated, so he had resources that the average slave would not have had by any stretch. And he was able to do something with his life to realize a vision, to encourage others to realize a vision, and to act on it without falling into the cycle of viciousness and hostility that we see in the world right now. Right? There's so much viciousness, the hostility going around and around. Again, the rally cry from the French Revolution that would become the rally cry of so much of the Haitian Revolution and the inspiration of the spirit: liberty, equality, and fraternity. I don't claim to fully understand these terms. These are big terms: liberty, equality, and fraternity, or brotherhood, or sisterhood, or sense of belonging, humans seeing eye to eye. But in the history of Haiti, we see that vision manifest in a way that would be wonderful to see in so many other parts of the world right now. A genuine overthrowing of those who claim to be working in the interests of equality, liberty, and fraternity even, but are obviously manufacturing systems of injustice and unfairness and cruelty. So in Haiti, when you hear the word Haiti, we don't want to dismiss, especially now. Haiti's had a troubled history in the last 200 years, right up to the present. We can see the economic, the lack of political leadership. I don't know why the economic problems have persisted. There are a lot of reasons, no doubt, but the economic situation in Haiti has persisted. Haiti is so much more than just a poor country. It's very much a country that can teach us, a history of teaching us to think about racism and the powers of colonization being reversed isn't the right word, because you can't simply go back pre-colonization, but resisted and overcome, and a new way of thinking or living realized. And I think there's quite a bit to that. Louverture clearly believed that leadership had to have a reciprocal relationship, that a leader couldn't be a top-down model where leaders dictated to others what they really needed, what they really ought to be doing. If you're going to be a leader, you had to have an understanding of what people genuinely needed. In the end, Napoleon was able to arrest him. 1803, he died of pneumonia. He had been deported back to France and jailed, not given a fair trial. But the revolution continued without him. And the next year, 1804, Haiti officially declares itself independent from France. That part of the mission accomplished. Of course, it wasn't the end of the story, but that milestone had been reached. When I think of the history of Haiti, what hits me the most is this idea that, and I've said this a couple of times already, that when the world around you is lying to you and hurting you because of your color or your gender or your economic class, and they're lying to you in the name of fairness or justice or whatever kind of enlightenment principle they want to use against you, know that there are people, peoples, plural, in Haiti, or Louverture, who could see through that and not only envision what real liberty and equality might mean, but they were able to achieve it in a very real way. If that's not the epitome of hope and encouragement, I don't know what is. Let's move on and talk about Edward Said and the concept of Orientalism. A controversial figure, controversial concept, Orientalism. Edward Said, quite well known, famous, a modern scholar, died in 2003 after a decade-long struggle with leukemia, which is very sad. He's controversial for a number of reasons, and I think it's largely because he's calling out what most of us suffer from. I think all of us suffer in some degree, which are just implicitly bad prejudices or biases or prejudgments about people that we've never even met. So that would make you controversial, calling out something that happens to us regardless of the culture we're in and regardless of education. There's a sense in which this might be almost a terminal thing, where some cultures are unwilling to move beyond that. It's just, I hate you, you hate me, the end of the story. But coming away from Edward Said and thinking about Orientalism, I hope there will be a sense of optimism here, especially in the context of racism or sexism or any other ism in which we see the other as bad. There's a sense of optimism that we don't need to be in conflict, and that if we challenge our assumptions and biases, we can all be better off. That's what I take away from this. Well, what is Orientalism? It asks us questions like, how do we get to know strangers? It asks us to think about, well, why is it that I think I know people I've never met, and I think I know countries that I've never been to? And why is it that I often think of them in a negative way and my own country as superior? Isn't that odd? That so many of us, again, regardless of your country, often think my country is better than the other. That's strange. What's my evidence for that? And what if I'm not only wrong about it, but that in my wrongness, I hurt other people? I'm tearing other people down. I'm not just dismissive, but maybe I invade them with the message of freedom, that I will free you. I'm going to bring freedom to you whether you want it or not. All based on my assumption that they're not free, that they're not enlightened, that they're not educated. But there's pretty huge implications to this idea of Orientalism. We may be tempted to swap in the term prejudice or prejudgment for Orientalism, but he is speaking from his own personal experiences as someone who grew up in an Arab country. The word Orientalism, from the Orient, simply means east. I mean, there's actually a larger discussion about the term and where it comes from and the meanings. But in its most basic sense is the east. So if you're in Europe, or if you're in a Western hemisphere like the Americas, you look east, you're talking about the Arab countries, Syria, Egypt, Iraq, Iran, and so on. So it's sort of a geographical thing. But if you're in the Middle East, you wouldn't necessarily look at the Western world, and we wouldn't necessarily call that Orientalism. We will call that whatever we'd want to call that. It would be a different term. So his focus is as a person with very clear experiences of a world that when he came to the West and he became educated here and teaching here and writing books here, his experiences didn't match up with how scholars were perceiving it and how the average citizen perceived people from the Middle East, Arab countries. They just didn't match. So Orientalism is a very personal thing to him, something he believes he has experienced, but it's something that you and I live. It's something that you and I perpetuate. Culture perpetuates, not just media. Maybe one of the best ways to describe it is in terms of glasses. And people talk about lenses, right? Lenses through which you see the world. Orientalism would be invisible lenses. You don't know that you have this racist attitude. You don't know. That's the power of this idea here. It's so in you, or in us, in me, that it's not until we really begin to challenge our assumptions, and it's not until we experience other people and maybe go to actually visit these places and become more enlightened, that we realize, wow, my views were pretty negative. You may have heard stories of the white supremacist, right? Hates everybody, thinks they're superior, and then they become friends, coincidentally, happenstance. They become friends with someone of color, and they realize that they're basically the same, right? So that Orientalism thing is the stuff or the ideas that prevent us from seeing and connecting with other people. Orientalism is a way of justifying colonialism, hurting other people, forcing your version of freedom on other people. It's a very active thing. It's not just lenses, or I see you one way, now I see you another. It's a whole way of living. But now imagine an entire culture having lenses that they don't know. I know I'm wearing glasses, but they have these lenses in which they hate other people. I hate you. Whether it's the East hates the West, West hates the East, whatever. There's a lot of hate going around. And they think they're right. And really, they've been given these lenses by stereotypes that aren't true, by a cultural consensus that's not true, by Hollywood movies, largely Hollywood movies. Right? Every terrorist is brown, and so on and so on. You know the story about how assumptions spread, stereotypes take on a power of their own. And so, Edward Said wants us to just ask, do we have lenses? We do, but what are they? And how might I begin to systematically challenge them? Now, an extreme form of Said's research comes across, to me at least, as saying there are some of us who obviously don't want to challenge our Oriental views, but sometimes I get that sense that we can't. It's so bad that we can't change them. And I'm not sure that that's actually what he's saying. Again, I come away from Said with a positive feeling that why talk about this stuff if we couldn't change it, right? Why talk about the prejudices and stereotypes unless we could do something productive about them? And the sense that cultures don't need to be at war with one another. And that's optimistic, right? Given the history of humanity in one of perpetual struggle and conflict. So talking about Orientalism may be one means of getting through this. So what else is Orientalism? It draws attention to a binary logic in racism and sexism and all these other things, a binary logic. We'll talk about that. Let's talk about the three basic principles of Orientalism. The first one is that if you are suffering from this malady, or if you're suffering from this poor way of seeing the world, which all of us are to some degree, then you see that there is an us and a them. Well, you can see that in football, you can see that in any sport, right? There's an us and a them. There's some sort of competition, there's a conflict. But is that the case? Simply because we come from different cultures and we have different languages and we have different norms, and these can be radically different, right? Very different. Why does it have to be the case that there's this inherent conflict of an us and a them? If you suffer from the worst forms of colonial or just active violence forms of Orientalism, then you probably don't see the other as equal. You probably don't see the other as equally worthy of happiness in life, of attention, of rights. There's the us and the them, but there's a hierarchy to an us and a them. On the football field, the us and the them are equal in some fundamental way, knowing that one of them is going to win, but at the end of the day, they're all kind of sportsmen about it. In this context, there's an us at the top, and then a them. We talked about the slavery, the issue, the hierarchy of society. One way of thinking about this is in terms of an objectification. The Oriental attitude, he talks about Napoleon as an example. Napoleon invades, he goes to Egypt. He brings soldiers, of course, and scientists. And one of the things they do is they do all kinds of measurements and recordings of Egypt to know Egypt, as if they could know Egypt in a way that the Egyptians themselves could not know it. In other words, they objectify the culture. They codify it in some sort of scientific, modern European lingo. Said talks about how they write down these big 3-meter size books, which is very interesting. Now, but think about that for a second. The belief that you were so powerful in your ability to understand the world, in your version of knowledge, that you could go to a country whose language you don't speak, and people you don't know, customs you're probably unaware of, and you could map it or measure it or codify it in a book and then leave. I've lived my entire life in this country, and I still can't claim to know much of it, really. It's a big country. I obviously haven't traveled. But how long would it take for me to get, say I went to Spain or I went to France, how long would I have to be living there with the people, experiencing the people and the customs and the languages, before I could feel entitled enough to say, I know you? It's a strange thing, right? Orientalism now actually has a long history of this kind of objectification in scholarship, the scholarship of the Orient, whether it's depicted in art or engineering, architecture, you name it. In the West, as Napoleon did, there's this idea that you can codify these places and countries, you can put them on paper, and you know them. You can't put me on paper. You can know all my measurements and how much I weigh, and I mentioned this in a previous video. You could even know the chemical equation of how much phosphorus is in my body, but you would not know me. So in trying to be objective, we're actually radically reducing the other to a very strange kind of quantification that we feel privileged, that we feel like we know. And the argument is this kind of us and them, this kind of looking at the them and objectifying them and trying to make sense of them academically, it doesn't. And it betrays our own sense of prejudice. And it only furthers the ignorance of other people. It just makes the situation worse. That's not being with people. It's attempting to control or to dominate. We can go back to Foucault and talk about how knowledge is power, the belief that if you know how big the pyramids are and you know how much the pyramids weigh, I'm making this up, that you somehow have power over the pyramids. You don't. You don't. It's an illusion. And so the information that Napoleon gathered from Egypt and would tell you some interesting things, no doubt, but it didn't give you access to the people. It certainly didn't give you access to understanding the culture as humans understand humans. So there's an asymmetry here, the us and them. There's a hierarchy implied. It's exemplified in the scholarship. And when the scholars on the Orient make these same mistakes, these same common assumptions and the same narrative, so he talks a fair bit about how he's just shocked that the same way of depicting these countries just repeats itself throughout the highest scholarship and the highest forms of literature, literary critique, music, art. It's so strange, except that we realize that in fact this sense of objectifying the other really doesn't touch reality. It doesn't really connect in a rich way. It's, in other words, very superficial. It's very superficial, and that makes it somewhat dangerous. Another way of phrasing this idea of an us and them is to think of it in terms of an object-subject relationship, where I'm a subject, I'm from the West, I'm enlightened, I'm scientific, whatever, and you are the object of my study. Objects aren't human, right? Objects are non-human. So I'm going to treat you in a non-human way, as something to be measured, not to be related to. Maybe that's the best way of thinking about it. The Orientalism, the us and the them, creates a hierarchy in which I'm not really relating to you. I'm just codifying you. I'm packaging information about you so I feel like I control the situation in some way, but I'm not relating to you. So Orientalism frustrates genuine human relationships. The second one, closely related to the first, is that Westerns dominate and the Orientals need to be dominated, and for their own good. So you in the East are objects to be studied, things to be coded, not things to be related to, because you're not my equal, you're not our equal. So I'm going to dehumanize you because that's just your place in the world. You're somehow less human, whatever that might mean. And one of the ways that I know that we're in a situation in which I dominate, my understanding of you dominates, or my prejudices dominate, but some way I dominate, and you are the object of my domination. One of the ways I know that, to contest that, is that I'm never surprised. You never do anything that I didn't anticipate. And the trick to understanding this concept is that I'm never surprised by anything you do, because in fact, I don't know you, and I don't know how you live your life. So I can't be surprised, because my knowledge of you is just my prejudice, my lenses. I'm not in touch with you, I'm not in contact with you to know you. So you can't surprise me. Surely, if I understood, again, I'm making an us and them assumption here, but if I understood your country, I understood your place in the world, there would be days where you would do something shocking, revelatory, human rights movement, or gene splicing, new science developed. Instead, in my mind, you are always the same savage. You're always the same despot. You're always the same immature culture. And so, because I don't really know you, there's no dynamic relationship in which I might be surprised. So that's the test. How many cultures are surprising you in a positive way that challenges your stereotypes, your tropes? This is an amazing test, really. What cultures surprise me? And we don't have to beat ourselves up if we're not super surprised all the time, because frankly, a lot of us aren't paying a lot of attention to other cultures right now. We have enough to deal with on our own plate right here. But still, that's a pretty good test. If I'm never surprised, that might be because I'm never really knowing the other. I'm never really connecting with the other. Third principle in Orientalism is the idea that because you aren't a subject like me, because you're an object, you're a thing, because you're less than, you aren't really self-sufficient. You really can't lead your own countries. You can't really be educated or fully enlightened. The term enlightened, just think about that for a moment, as if the room was dark and now the light has come on. Orientalism, if it's functioning in me, will be such that I don't think you're really capable of being enlightened. So I will always have to be a parent to a child over you. And that might mean invading your country to bring you freedom. That might mean writing international rules and laws to chastise you when you do something I don't like. It means not treating you as a human being that might surprise me, but as an object to be controlled or dominated. And we've seen this in terms of feminism. Now we're talking about racism, but just generally in terms of power structures in any culture. The dehumanize is to then try to control in many ways, simultaneously to do them both. You know, those Middle Eastern countries, they have no way of governing themselves well because they're not as rational as we are. They can't reason or think. they're more like animals. So we need to control the situation. We need to control them for their own benefit. We simply govern better because we have the power of knowledge. We have the power of reason. We're more educated. These are some of the assumptions. Now, let's be clear. Some countries are better than others. Some are terrible. They have terrible views about how to treat other people, a lot of misery, a lot of anger and hate. But this egotistical sense that I come from a culture that's better, when it's not justified, when it has no basis in reality, its simple assumption or prejudice or bias is so dangerous. As part of the trick of being a modern country is being able to say, I'm modern and better because why? How do you know when you're better? Because you're more compassionate? I would say that's probably better than the alternatives. Because you have more pity? I would say that's maybe better. But how do you know? Orientalism tells you you're better. You just believe it. It's another form of Orientalism might be patriotism, this unearned sense of dignity and superiority. When if you look at your own historical track record of whichever country you're in, so I'm in Canada, there's so much shame to go around that it would be very hard to just boastfully say Canada's better than X or Y. This leads into the concept of Orientalism as a sense of projection in which we're simply better than you, and that's the way it is. But we don't notice that what's happening is we're taking all the bad things of our own culture and our own prejudices and stereotypes, and we're pushing them on other people that we don't know, we've never met, and we're making them out to be the bad guy, the bad girl, whatever. Here's a list. It's just, this is not sites, but this is an example of a few terms that might fall into this us-them category. So us. We require proof, right? Because we're a scientific culture, that makes us better. I would argue that in many cases that is a very good way to live. But why do you assume that you require proof and they don't? Virtuous, rational, mature, character development, honest, right? That's things that we say are good about us. Not necessarily that no one else has them, but that's what makes us good. By contrast, the them are irrational, are childlike, they lie all the time, they're lazy, they thrive on flattery. Now, if you think about these different ways, these binary, right? These are binary now, the us and them, and the character traits between the two. If you think about them, do we really think as a culture that we can so overly generalize to be even close to accurate? It's a problem of racism. One of the problems of racism and Orientalism is this sense of overgeneralization. I can look at a small group of people and use that as a sample group to say, therefore, millions of people are just like them. I can look at two people from a country that have been found guilty of being terrorists, and in my head say, oh, all of Egypt, they're full of terrorists. Or I can think of a group of white nationalist racists in the US marching down the street with the torches and the hats even. And I say, oh, well, all of America is full of a bunch of racists. And that's silly. That's overgeneralization. And that's as silly as me having a pizza from one pizza store and not liking it and then saying all pizza on the planet is terrible. It just doesn't make sense. So this mechanism of Orientalism is doing a few things. It's egregiously oversimplifying. It's pushing a binary of us and them, which is simultaneously a hierarchy of I'm better than you. And it's pushing these traits that we don't like about ourselves or we don't like about our culture. It's kind of scapegoating. If we went back to Freud, it's that scapegoating. And when we put these negativity, these things that are negative on other people, that makes us feel great. Meanwhile, in our own backyard, things are burning, right? Because we have so many issues, we have so many problems. And I think this is in large part something we all suffer from. We want to feel good about ourselves. We want to feel special, right? We want to have a sense of confidence. And so it's natural to look at other people and want to tear them down, if even for a moment that makes us feel good. But again, that's a wildly obvious sign of immaturity, and something that hurts not just me long term, people around me, but when cultures do it against cultures, that can be incredibly damaging. So Orientalism as projection, if that's happening, and I think it largely does, that's the kind of thing we can be questioning. Am I pushing negative stereotypes so that I feel good about myself, I feel good about my country, when I really haven't earned it, right? I haven't done the legwork to develop the character that I should have, so I'm just going to poke fingers or point at people and say they're bad. Orientalism in a nutshell is the claim that you and I do not have a realistic connection or representation with other people. We have codified pieces of information that are largely inaccurate, generalized stories, the same repertoire of images and ideas. Everything is like Aladdin. The movie, the Aladdin, whether it's a cartoon or the more recent movie, that's your full understanding of an Arab country, and so that's it. That's all you need to know. Life is just like Aladdin. Even the simplest of reflection and self-criticism blows that out of the water. And still, as a culture, we suffer from that terrible oversimplification. The overgeneralizing, making Muslims, as an example, from 6 different countries, we think of them as the same, when in fact they can be wildly different. Neighboring countries can have wildly different views of religion and doctrine and how they think about their faith. But again, that Oriental view, just one, right? There's just one homogeneous, and it's all the same, and it's all bad. This leads into this greater esteem for oneself, in which I become privileged, and because I'm privileged, I should rule you, or I should be in charge, or I should be writing laws, not just for your benefit, also for my benefit, but I'll convince myself that I'm in charge of you for your benefit, because that's just another thing that makes me feel special, when in fact, this is just justifying that same colonial ambition for money and power. Let's be honest, this is the basic motive, right? People that want money and power, that's why they go to other places. That's why they try and take things from people that's not theirs. It's just that further expression of greed and all of these different things. But one way of justifying that terrible greed and that terrible self-interest is by saying, I'm here to help the savages. I'm here to make them more human. Now, they'll never be as human as me, of course. They can never be as human as me. That's reserved for me. But still, out of charity and the goodness of my heart, while I'm taking your oil and your land and these different things, maybe I'll start a school or two where you can learn English so that you can be programmers in my factory where I pay you minimum wage, of course. To answer the question then, what is racism? I think this maps on really quite well. You're a racist when you refuse to relate to another person, and in that refusal to relate, you find justification for making them less, dehumanizing them, objectifying them, whatever term you want to use. You elevate yourself at the expense of others. This is all racism. When you allow your assumptions, it doesn't matter where they came from, whether it's from your church, your politician, your lawyer, your doctor, whether from popular media, it doesn't matter where these views come from, but when you allow them to dominate and to hurt other people, that's racism. So what is racism? Racism is a way of justifying an Oriental view. Racism is a way of justifying a dismissive, objectifying view. Racism is another way in which people try to control the other. And they do it, or we do it, or I do it, through extraordinary thoughtlessness, where I simply refuse to be aware of my own limitations and my own stereotypes and how they don't connect with reality. So racism is a self-fulfilling prophecy of always elevating myself and putting the other down. And it doesn't have to be just race, of course. It could be a matter of sex, religion. So many different things fall into this category. So does Orientalism help us access or understand cultural conflict? I think so. Are we at risk of being Orientalists? Absolutely. What do we do about it? Again, I think the remedy for most of these issues that we've been discussing is thinking about them, dialogue, conversation, bringing to the fore, bringing to the front, becoming aware of those things that have been hidden from us, like our lenses. So just in having this conversation and thinking about the possibility that I might be a racist simply in the belief that I'm somehow enlightened or rational, and that I really haven't challenged my views of other people. All of this, I think, is a positive step forward.